What's up, everyone? This is Ryan here, and you are watching episode 35 of my live stream Q&A. So hopefully the sound is working and everything. Yeah, let's just get started here. Apologies for being a couple minutes late. When you, I think when you see the lesson I'm about to give on RxJava, you'll probably understand why, because I made it this morning, and hopefully it's pretty good, but yeah, anyways, we'll get to that stuff in a moment, but before I continue, so I just wanted to mention a couple things. The following show is brought to you by me and all the wonderful people who support the show by liking, subscribing, sharing my content on preferred social media platforms and so forth. So if you appreciate what I do, please consider doing any of those things. And if you're interested in helping me a little bit more directly to purchase better equipment and eventually do this kind of thing full time, which means more content and live streams, then consider throwing me a couple bucks on PayPal or Patreon. Speaking of, I would like to thank the following people for supporting me on Patreon. So that's going to be Seth Keegan, Trevor Halvorsen, Bassam Helal, Tina Fredericks, Nanotech, A. Amon, Mr. Bidwell, Graham Hertzeg, Sushil Chanda, Elad Stavi, Shoku Mostofi, and Tomas. So to all those people, I say thank you very kindly. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting episode today. Kind of the big topic that I'll be talking about, the big lesson, so to speak, is RxJava. And basically what happened is I was actually asked by someone on the Slack channel if I could try and explain RxJava, because I would say RxJava may be sort of the most complicated, maybe it's one of the most misunderstood tools on the Android platform. Dagger 2 is pretty high up there, but the thing about Dagger 2 is it is complicated, but ultimately Dagger 2 really is just a dependency injection tool. Whereas RxJava in particular, as we'll see, it is sort of an implementation of the observer pattern, but it's a lot more than that. And that's where people have a lot of trouble, is to try and sort of explain what RxJava is. You need to talk about a lot of different things, and you need to unpack several ideas before you can even kind of get to talking about what RxJava is. So that's kind of what I've endeavored to do in this lesson, which I'll be giving shortly. But before I get to that, let's just see what's up in the chat. What's up, everyone? So we've got Chitan, Mr. Bidwell, Tina, Andronicus, and Taha joining me right off the bat. So to all those people, welcome. So what do we got here? Looks like we have a question about retrofit. I'll check on that later. So basically how this works, Taha, is sometimes I just do all Q&A. In today's show, I'm going to be giving a lesson on RxJava first, and knowing me, that could end up being like a half-hour long. I do apologize. Well, actually, no, I don't apologize for taking my time to explain myself, but it might take a little while. But I will try and get to your question later on, and we will do some Q&A at that point. So anyways, just give me a moment here. Just got some housekeeping stuff going on. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of jump into RxJava. So quick thing just before that, just a little announcement. So I'm basically, over the past week, I've been writing a pretty long article on not just ModelView Presenter, but it's an article which kind of unpacks the most fundamental ideas you need to know about designing basic 3-layer architectures. So, and basically my plan was, originally I was going to do a ModelView Presenter tutorial series, and I will do that like a video series, but I thought, well, why don't I take my time, put everything down in writing first, and then make the video from that? Because one of the things I'm learning quite rapidly, and this could be an interesting discussion point later on, is that my architectures really are no longer necessarily just MVP There's certainly not just MV, VM. I won't complain about that, I swear. And yeah, so things are kind of evolving for me, and it's interesting because one of my friends, Darrell, has also been talking about how he's developing sort of a new architecture which takes model view presenter principles and model view ViewModel principles and model view intent principles. And so the whole gist of it is I want the article to kind of go away from the jargon, to go away from the names and just talk about, okay, what are the actual concepts here that we need to learn about. Anyways, so that's just kind of an announcement. The article is mostly finished. I can even give you a really, if my screen will load. Thank you, OBS Studio. Come on. There we go. I can even give you a sneak preview of the article. It's this is it. As you can see, I like to write, and I'll just show you some of the headings I came up with. So this is one. A view is a view is a view is a view is a reference to. It's a poetic reference, and then this is my favorite subheading, and this is sort of a stealth criticism of model view ViewModel architecture, but one of my headings is called "Sticking Feathers Up Your Butt Does Not Make You a View Model," which is of course a Fight Club reference. And the reason why I said that is in that particular section I talk about how do you actually figure out if what you have in front of you is a view, and it has to do with cohesion and things. So anyways, it's going to be, I think, a pretty good article because I unpack separation of concerns, cohesion, three-layer architectures, data, logic, user interface, kind of separation of concerns, and all kinds of lovely stuff. But I am already rambling like crazy. We're 7 minutes in. It felt like 2 minutes for me. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to shut the hell up, and in a moment I'm going to talk about RxJava. Just need a little of that caffeine going before I get into this. Okay. Oh, and I hear sirens outside. Sounds like my ride's here. Ha ha. Is he joking? Okay, so. Oh yes, sorry about that. The sirens are really loud out there. So where are my notes? So let's just get started with the preamble. So so what do we got here? We are 8 minutes in. Oops, not 98 minutes in. Hasn't been that long. Oops. I'm trying to do timestamps as I answer questions and do the lessons because I just don't have time to go back and do timestamps for old videos anymore, unfortunately. So today's lesson is going to be about RxJava and the sort of, what I'm going to call this lesson is the observer pattern on steroids. So I had a question from a viewer which was basically, could you explain RxJava? I guess 28 is, I don't know why that seems smaller than usual. Let's go to 30. So I had a viewer ask if I could sort of explain how RxJava works, and as I kind of mentioned in the beginning of this, it's a very difficult topic because it is kind of primarily one concept, which I'll unpack in a moment, but the thing about it is it's more than that. How I would liken it is it's almost like the difference between, say, you have a tool called a saw, and just like a hand saw, and so that thing's called a saw, and then we also have this tool called like a really heavy-duty table saw with attachments and different blades and different things you can do, like a really complicated thing that's a saw. So these things are both saws, but the problem is, you know, one of them is like the simple version and one of them is like the really complicated version. So I wasn't even really planning to use that analogy, but one of my goals in this discussion here is I want to give you a way to think about RxJava. Because what I think I did wrong is I tried to explain RxJava a couple weeks ago by going line by line through the implementation and focusing just on what it does and not so much what it is. which is a tactic I will use when I don't understand something up front. But what I realized is that's not really enough. You do kind of need some help there. So without further ado, let me discuss RxJava. What it is, the bedrock understanding you need to understand what's going on, its features, and there will be some code, and this could be a very long lesson, but hopefully this will be the video or the discussion that helps you understand RxJava. So the first thing I'm going to do is let me just pull up some slides which I've prepared. And we're going to be, of course, wrestling with the Windows 10 photo viewer, as usual. I just love doing that. So let me just get set up here, because I got a whole bunch of... I got notes off to the side, and I got my OBS studio on, and I got all these different things. So just give me a moment to arrange everything. Because this stuff is not easy to talk about. I'll tell you that right off the bat. Okay, I think we're ready to go here. So RxJava, the idea I'm gonna start with is that essentially what RxJava is, and do note that the code samples I'll be showing you are RxJava 2 specifically, but the principles will basically be the same. But essentially what RxJava is it's like the observer pattern on steroids. And what I kind of mean by that is it's just my funny way of basically saying it's like a really high-powered version of the observer pattern, and then there's more to it than that. So that's kind of my first point here, is that ultimately what RxJava is it's sort of an implementation of the observer pattern, which is a well-documented and understood pattern, and you can look this up on your own, and I would suggest that. So I'll give you a quick explanation of how I would explain the observer pattern. Why is it not changing? Maybe I won't. Okay, really? Windows 10. So when I'm zoomed in on an image, I can't change it, but when I zoom out, then I can change it. Great. Awesome user experience, guys. That makes absolute sense. Okay, sorry about that. You knew what to expect when Ryan uses Windows 10 Photo Viewer. So, what is the observer pattern? I didn't plan that, by the way. So, what is the observer pattern? And this is the most fundamental thing you need to understand about RxJava. Now, as just a really quick point here, this is the first big difficulty people have, is the jargon. There are two main concepts you need to nail down first, two main definitions. Those definitions, there is an observer, which is something that just watches, sort of like an object or an event stream, and an object or an event stream, essentially what those are is they are subjects. So a subject is something that creates that which, great English there, subject is that, actually no, that is proper English. Subject is that which creates / causes events. So when you look into different implementations of strictly the observer pattern, those are the two main definitions you need to hold in your head. Whether you're looking at RxJava, which uses some different names, or you're looking at some other Rx library, which might use other names, those are the two things you need to nail down. So we have an observer, which is an object that watches something, and we have a subject, which is an object that basically can be watched, can produce events. So I forgot what my next slide is, so hopefully I'll remember what to talk about. Right. So why do we what does the observer pattern do for us? What is the difference? So, oh, was I in, sorry, I was in the, let me just go back to that slide really quick. Sorry, I guess I was talking with the full screen view. Anyways, this is the slide. I can share the slides later. So why do we want the observer pattern, and what does it kind of do for us is the next point. So hopefully I've explained to you, RxJava is a way to achieve, it's an implementation of the observer pattern, and what the observer pattern is fundamentally is instead of objects directly sending messages to each other, they can observe each other. They can observe for changes. Now that might not make sense to you right away, so let's keep going, and I think that'll start to make sense as I keep explaining these different slides here. But why do we want objects to just sometimes watch each other, or just sometimes be capable of producing events, instead of every object knowing lots of details about each other? The reason why is it promotes, number one, loose coupling. So what that essentially means is the tethers, the communication tethers between various objects are quite loose, and not like, if we're doing like direct calls between concrete implementations, so my activity directly calls a room database, that's like tight coupling. Like if you change one thing, it's going to change the other. Whereas the observer pattern, you sort of eliminate a lot of that headache simply by way of the pattern itself. When I get to the code, that'll start to make more sense. The other thing is that it allows for many-to-one relationships between subjects and observers. So this is another really key point. So what that means for this is also, in other words, what I'm saying is this is another factor of loose coupling. When your code is loosely coupled, you can change it. You could add another observer, and that won't change the current observer, and it shouldn't change the subject. So what I'm saying here is you can change things easily because of the observer pattern. It's one of the ways we can really promote loose coupling in our architecture. So hopefully that makes sense. I'm just going to kind of charge along here because otherwise this will take forever. So next slide. So essentially what RxJava is, so hearing that, you might be tempted to think, as I was, that RxJava is just sort of the observer pattern. It's actually a lot more than that. It's almost a bunch of extra tools you get once you start using this sort of observer-subject dynamic. So essentially what RxJava can do is that it allows you to sort of compose and build and create and wire together these observers and subjects. And this is not meant to confuse you, but something can be an observer and a subject. We'll see that later. You can compose these things together as event streams, and that's where the name reactive streams sort of comes from, is once you start to apply this observer pattern, you can almost treat things like as something which either produces an event, relays an event, listens for an event, or changes an event. I'll talk about what an event is in a moment. So let's look at kind of a visual example here of an event stream. I literally made this morning, so you know, bear with me, as Devore loves it when I say. So what is an event stream? So what I'm going to do now is, so this is, again, one of the main things I think people have difficulty with is they're learning about RxJava and they don't even have a way to think about what's going on. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and explain like two metaphors for you to understand what an event stream is. So what I've said is RxJava allows you to build an event stream. Well, what is an event stream? Essentially, one example, one of them, I would say the most common example with RxJava is creating an event stream out of, say, something which occurs in the back end. So we could say database, we could say network, we could say system service over here. Some value, some piece of data down here gets created, or an event occurs where this object gets created. So let's say our retrofit adapter calls back with data, or a database returns data. So it creates an event stream where that event starts here in the back end. It'll flow through the architecture maybe you should have a boundary between your back end and your front end. And while it's flowing through this event stream, objects can like grab. I want you to think as this ball is rolling or floating down the event stream to get to the front end, the view, we have like the end, and then it's flowing, and then say I want to change it part way through, or maybe I want to check this value to see if it was successful or if it needs to be mapped or converted into another object. And then I keep it going down the event stream. And so what that kind of looks like is we get this scenario where our whole architecture, not necessarily the whole, certain parts of it, the asynchronous parts, become streams of events, and then these objects travel through these events when they are triggered, and they change over time if we need them to. And very often we need them to, because a data model that's appropriate for the back end probably won't be appropriate for the front end. So hopefully that's one metaphor. So we're saying we're treating these events that propagate from one class to the other as like an event stream which gets set up, and then while this stream is created, represented by the big arrow, we can send values down the stream. What's a metaphor for this? Because this might still be quite vague for certain people. I'm going to tell you a quick funny story. One of my first jobs when I moved out of home when I was 17 into a big new city was working as a suit salesman in a really old clothing store. This is true. This clothing store was so old that it actually had remnants of a tube system for receipts or bills. So when I never had to do this, but in years past, when a customer bought a piece of clothing, that receipt would get written up, a paper receipt, and then it would get fed into a tube system, which is what you see here, a pneumatic tube system. So how this works is you put the tube, which has like a payload. It's got like a receipt, a little a capsule, not unlike a cup or a plastic tube or a glass tube. So you put the value in it, you put it into the tube, and then it goes boom, and it flies up the tube. Now, what I want you to imagine is, let's say we're running a business, like a big multi-story business, and say we have some department down below, the sales department feeds a tube into, or feeds a value into the tube system. I'm confusing myself because I'll say like a container into the tube system is a better way of putting it. So we feed a container into the tube system, and then let's say it first goes to the accounting department to verify the credit card number or whatever, it doesn't matter. And then eventually it goes to maybe the filing room to store the receipt or something like that. So what I want you to think of is, as a useful metaphor for thinking about RxJava, we're having our objects or the different layers of our architecture communicate through each other by passing these values or what do I call them? Whatever, containers through a tube system, which is like a reactive stream. So hopefully that was a serviceable analogy which can help you start to understand what's going on with RxJava. And I'm going to mention a couple extra things that it does, and then we'll look at some code to cement the metaphor. So kind of my last little slide here is, I mentioned that RxJava is like the observer pattern on steroids. And what I mean by that is you get lots of extra features. It's not just the observer pattern. You can compose multiple streams together. I will show you an example of that shortly. You can change values passed through the stream based on logic. I will show you that shortly. And you can easily manage threading. I will show you that shortly. So there's lots more I could talk about. There's again, like to go back to my original metaphor, one of the problems is if you ask me what a hand saw is, like for cutting wood, if you ask me what a hand saw is, I can explain that to you pretty easily. And then if you ask me what like a complicated multi-tool table saw with all kinds of attachments and so forth is, yeah, I can call it a saw, but that's not really going to give you most of the picture. It's, you know, a lot more complicated than that. So that's basically the theory section of my explanation of RxJava. And the next thing I'll do is I'll take you through some code to sort of demonstrate a couple things I talked about here. And again, my goal is to get you to start thinking of RxJava in your head, not as some magic, not as magic, but really just a communication system, essentially. A really powerful communication system. So I'm going to open up Kotlin Calculator, and link in the description box below if you're curious about this particular, the code in this example. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at, I didn't actually prepare this ahead of time, so you'll have to forgive me, but I'm going to open up a couple of different classes here. All right. And so what we're going to do is what I would like to show you now is an event stream in the code. So everything I just talked about, remember the tube analogy and all that, I want to show you why I chose that analogy and how it actually translates to the code. So what I want you to imagine is, let's say we have like the front end of our architecture. So again, to go back to this little diagram here. So I'm going to show you a presenter, and I want you to kind of just think of that as like the front end. It's the observer at the end. So within Kotlin Calculator, we're going to look at the presenter. And what I want you to notice, so this is a calculator application. And what I want you to notice here is that essentially what I've done is I've represented an event, so like a click event, so when someone hits the equals button, as an event stream, that thing I talked about earlier. So when an event, like a click event, occurs, then what we're going to do is we have this event stream thing, and we execute a call on this thing called a use case. We don't really need to worry too much about that, but essentially we have this object. I won't even use the name. We're going to say to some object, our presenter is going to say to this object, evaluate this expression. So we've got like the start of an event, which is actually occurring synchronously. Notice here we haven't yet returned an observable or anything, but we are calling this method. And what we're doing is we're saying, when we call this method, I want you to actually create like an apparatus around this single method call that can do everything from telling this resulting value, telling the event stream to listen to, or telling this particular observer to listen to the value on the UI scheduler, so on a UI thread. And then this is also the place where we say, hey, this is where we actually want to handle the event stream once the event finally reaches its destination. So we're saying, our front end is saying, hey, back end, do this calculation. The back end is like, okay, it does its thing, and then it's sending this object back. Okay. So what is this? So we have our observer here. So presenter is the observer in this case. There's different names, like there's this word subscriber, and there's observable and flowable. I'm not really going to talk about those too much, but what you want to know is this is another word for, say, observer. And that's again where some of the confusion starts. But anyways, I'm not going to get into those kinds of fine details because I actually talked about that in a different video. Okay, so we start our event. We call our evaluator to evaluate an expression. And we've said this is where we want to handle that. Let's hop into evaluate expression. So, excuse me. So our presenter knows almost nothing about this eval object. It doesn't know what it does behind the scenes. All it knows is that when eval does its thing, it's going to return, it's actually going to return essentially a flowable, which is a type of subject? See, this is where the jargon gets insane. Whatever. Anyways, let's just carry on here. So we call this method, and what does this method do? Or what does this method in the use case do? So what I said to myself is, okay, when I'm performing a calculation, I want an object which first checks to see if the expression passed into the calculation is valid. Is it something I can actually feed into a calculator kind of object and actually get something intelligible out of it? So first I validate the input. So what I want you to think of is, okay, so we've got this, as far as the, where's another, just let me show you another diagram. And this will kind of help to explain the point. No, piss off Windows 10. Screw you. Okay, here we go. So, so what we end up having, essentially what I'm showing you here in Kotlin Calculator. So we have the presenter, which is like the observer or the end point of the stream, where the stream terminates, which is like this thing here. So success, empty, error. And then we have our use case, which talks to like the back end. And what the use case does is it calls two different services. So we have a validator to check if the equation is valid, and we have a calculator to check if the, to calculate the equation if it is valid. So, sorry, I got a message pop up from YouTube and it's distracting. Anyways, so what we have essentially is, so this is like the use case I'm showing you, and these are the back-end services. So this is like the validator, and this is like the calculator. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. So we have like a stream going on here, and the presenter doesn't know about all these different streams and different events that can occur. So hopefully that's kind of making sense. So the last thing I'll kind of talk about here is what happens in this use case. So here is an example where we are taking, we've got an event stream which starts in the presenter, goes to a use case, and then forks into two services. So essentially we have like a many-to-one ratio. And what we can do is, for example, using the RxJava zip operator, we can wait for result of two subjects and compose them together before passing the value through to the observer. Now there's kind of a, I'm kind of leaving something out, which is that something can actually be both an observer and a subject. So this execute thing here, it's, so it is like listening. It is kind of its own observer in a way, but it's also going to produce all of this stuff. When this zip thing happens, the end result of it is we get this thing where our result is like an expression data model. So what I'm showing you here again is this thing. I'm showing you our backend basically has one kind of data model. So here we have this expression object, which is like a backend data model, and we want to sort of make it more appropriate for the view. So essentially what I'm showing you here, you can see this stuff is quite difficult to talk about, but I'm showing you not only are we propagating events from the backend and we're hiding things and composing streams together, but we're changing them over time. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And the last thing we'll do is I'll show you validation and calculator really quickly. So validation, it just gets given a string, and then the end result is that it produces some kind of value. So it's going to, at this point, as a subject, it will emit, let me zoom way the hell in. As a subject, it will emit a value at the end of this validation. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then that's essentially what's going on with the calculator is, again, when it's finished, when calculations are finished, emit the result. And so if we go back to this zip operator, what's happening is we're saying, validator, do your thing and emit the resulting calculation here. And same thing with calculator result. And both of these sort of objects will pop up here in this sort of anonymous kind of method. And this is, of course, the return types that our validator and calculator will actually return. We check first to see if that, first we check to see if it's valid. So if the expression is not valid, we don't even need to care about whether the expression worked. We're just saying create failure model. Something is wrong here. It's not a valid expression. Otherwise, we return a success model. And yeah, and so hopefully that's kind of making sense. So the end result is that to wrap things up, we're starting with an event which occurs in one object. It doesn't necessarily need to propagate through all layers, but it's going to start maybe in one layer or one object, and then it's going to pass down an event stream into the other object. So there's one more point, which is a key point, which I really need to talk about. So number one, you don't need to represent your entire application as event streams. This is one thing. When you're asking yourself, should I use RxJava here, you want to ask the question, is it something that changes over time? Do I need a many-to-one relationship? Do I need to control which thread it's on? And what I'm saying is, when it comes to things in your application which are like totally synchronous, so for example, whenever my view, which is a fragment, talks to the presenter, this doesn't necessarily need to be represented as an event stream. It can be, it totally can be. It's just when you start using RxJava everywhere, you better hope that everyone on your team is on board with that, because you don't actually need, not every event in a system is synchronous. However, most systems do have parts which are asynchronous, and that's kind of my general tip for where you should use RxJava. Anyways, we're almost 40 minutes in here, so I'm really hoping that that explanation helped people. I don't know how well that particularly went, but yeah, that's my lesson on RxJava, and hopefully that was okay. I'm going to catch my breath for a minute here and run a quick commercial break. If you enjoyed that or learned from that, do me a favor and hit the like button down below. And let me just look at some comments before I get back to talking. Oh. All right. So let's get started here. So, hey, what's up, Darrell? Okay, here we go. As you can see, that long explanation took a bit of energy out of me, so we'll see how the rest of the episode goes, because that RxJava, that's probably the most difficult concept I've ever tried to explain. So, if people actually like watch this, let me know if that was useful, because I'm trying to sort of. Okay, good. I'm glad it was helpful to at least some people, because it's the thing the difficulty is sometimes when you're explaining something, it makes sense to you, and what I really try and focus on is this making sense to the people who are listening? Because if it's not making sense to you, I'm not doing my job as a teacher, quite frankly. Whereas I find a lot of teachers kind of take the perspective, you should just be smarter, you know? Whereas I think if you can't explain what you're talking about, that's the fault of the teacher largely. Not everyone is going to be able to explain RxJava, but I'm certain everyone that's listening is a smart individual. So, anyways, so I have a question. So this is from. So this is not necessarily this is like just kind of a quick way to handle. I've got a question about retrofit. Yeah, how to retry post calls. You know what? The answer I'm going to give on this is like so low powered that I don't know if I'm even going to be able to help you with this, Taha, but basically the question is like, how do you retry retrofit calls or post calls when they fail? So like when the network comes back again. And unfortunately, I don't have code that I can show you, and that would be particularly useful in this case. But like one quick example, so a quick fix solution that I can show you, and this is like by far not, this is almost not even really answering your question, but let me just show you one quick example. Just pulling the code up here. Where is it? So one, like a really quick thing you can do to sort of handle retrying retrofit calls is, assuming you most likely you'll be using OK HTTP. And then you can configure your OK HTTP implementation to retry when the connection fails. However, there's going to be different ways to actually like check to see if the network is available and stuff. And I don't really have code I can show you right off the bat that would really help you that. So this is a quick way of handling connection failures, is to just basically tell OK HTTP when it fails, retry, and then you can like dictate the timeouts and then handle things in that nature. But yeah, that's, like I say, that's not really going to help you too much. So that's really just all I can help you with there, Taha. Not the best answer. Okay, what else have we got? So we got a question about my REST tutorial as well, another one. So we're gonna say, yeah, 4:30. Sorry, just give me 1 sec here. So yeah, sorry about that. The thing is, like, it can be very difficult when you're asking me like a very specific sort of implementation question. Those ones can be pretty difficult for me to answer off the top of my head, especially when I don't have code right in front of me. So sorry about that. But I have another question which is a little more conceptual, which I'm happy to try and answer. This is also about my retrofit app, or tutorial. So this is from Amy Reza. Okay. So, what are I don't even know what is ListViewModel? Okay, so Amazar asks what is / our ListViewModel and repository ViewModel in my REST tutorial repo. And I'll just say Ryan's REST tutorial tutorial. Wow, that's nice. Tutorial. There we go. Tutorial repo. Okay, so what is the ListViewModel and the repository ViewModel? So what I'll do is let's go ahead and open those things up, and I will try and answer your question. All right, so we've got Android REST tutorial. So this is the repository in question, and Amy Reza is asking. So what do we got? We got a ListViewModel is one of them. And then was it this one? Repository data model? I already forgot what the two. Repository view model. Maybe, are you sure it's repository view model? I think you mean repository data model, just as a minor point. That is important because, yeah, let me just double check on that. All right, so I'm going to assume you're talking about this ListViewModel and you're talking about this repository data model class, and you're asking what those are. So this is actually something I mentioned during my RxJava rambling, which is, so very often assuming you have divided your architecture into a front end and a back end, very often what you'll find is that the data models, and when I say data model, I really mean a class that just holds data and has getters and setters and is really just like a container which will get passed around the object like a baseball. Generally, you'll want a different kind of data model, a different kind of model for the back end, and a different kind of model for the front end. Now, the problem, and I understand why you're confused here, is that there's a lot of ambiguity going on with the names of these things. So what I'll kind of say, what you'll very often hear me complain about is the name ViewModel in the context of ModelViewModel. I'm not going to complain about that today, but what I'll say is there's like a ViewModel. This is my opinion, kind of, is that there are people who have this thing called ViewModel, and they're talking in the context of ModelViewModel architecture. I'm not going to talk about that. We're not just, so there might be some confusion going on. I'm not talking about ModelViewModel. What I'm saying is ViewModel, an object which, what I'll say is a data object which is suited for the front end view, and then data model, a data object which is suited for the back end. So, and then maybe in the middle we might have like an entity. Here's the thing, is we're dealing with a lot of people that don't necessarily have the same definitions. But in the context of that application, the view model is just a data object which is suited for the front end. The data model is something suited for the back end. And why would I do that? I would do that because if the back end model contains code to do with retrofit or code to do with some kind of back-end service, I don't want my front end to be working with an object which has that stuff in it. I want to map that object, and this is something where RxJava can help you. I want to map that object to something which is plainer and better suited for my front end to look at. So if I go specifically into those two classes, let's have a look here. I didn't close them, did I? No. Okay. So let's look at, so this is ListViewModel. So it's a data holder. So it's like has error, is loading. It has like the payload that it requires, the relevant data. And then it has like this list of items here. Or I guess that's just an error message. So this is something I would want to pass into the front end. And essentially, it's like a sort of an immutable data container. And down here, you'll notice there's like these create success model, create loading model, create error model. These are basically, I'm trying to control the way that these things get created. So instead of like calling up this, notice how this constructor is private. I create these objects statically through these methods. So that's kind of that's the front end model. And then this down here should be the back end model. And again, what I said before, why do we want a different model for the back end and a different model for the front end? I don't want this reference in my front end. And I don't want these ugly JSON styled variable names. Now, I do know that you don't actually have to map directly to ugly names here. You can use your parsing library to map to camel case names, but this was just quick and just, yeah, whatever. I didn't want to complicate it any more than that. But so essentially what I'm doing is, the reason why I would separate it is so I don't have something like this JSON Moshi thing in here that's going to, you know, whatever, complicate things and doesn't belong in the front end. Sorry, I'm having a lot of trouble explaining things after doing that long explanation, but so hopefully that kind of makes sense. So that's what those things are in the context of my project. So in either case, it's a model of some kind of data. Now, I'm going to confuse you a little bit, and this is just, you know, this is one of the difficulties with all the different confusing names, but you'll notice in my ModelViewPresenter application that it talks to a ViewModel object. So in this project, the ViewModel object is still fundamentally the same thing as that other project. It's still just a part of the model, ultimately, in terms of ModelViewPresenter. But what it does is it's like a front-end container, and it actually extends the ViewModel class from architecture components. So essentially, I think of it now as like a front-end data holder. So that's going to handle my data if the orientation changes and so forth. So on the surface, it seems like this is a totally different thing, but ultimately it's still just a data container. It's just like a more high-powered data container that is sort of almost exists independent of the presenter, instead of just having something that gets passed in. So the thing that's going on here is that we have all these different names, and we have different ways of implementing those names. And what I would suggest to you is whenever we're looking at the name model, in my opinion, it should really just have to do with data access and storage. And something which has the word model in it should not have a ton of logic. And it shouldn't be handling events from a view. And I know I said I wasn't going to be complaining about ModelViewModel, but I just did right there, and then I'll shut up about it now. But that's one of my gripes about the pattern ModelViewModel, is that to me it's evidently incomplete. You need some kind of controller in there Otherwise, your view model is both a view controller and a view model, which is not separation of concerns. So anyways, I can't seem to get through a live stream without complaining about that. Okay. So hopefully that answers that question somewhat well. Homeless Hobo asks about my opinion on Mosby, which, if I'm correct, is a library created by Hannes Dochman, who's the guy who also created ModelView intent software architecture. And it's a library which allows you, I think, to build ModelView presenter pieces quickly. Maybe it's more than that. And I'm asked, what do I think of Mosby, M-O-S-B-Y? And I'm not even going to write this down because I haven't actually used it. I've never, maybe it's, I'm not saying don't use it, but I don't like to use tools without a reason, and I've never felt like I needed something to build my ModelView presenter architecture for me. Now, maybe it's faster and more efficient, and I might basically be wasting my time doing it by hand, but I don't really have a great opinion on Mosby because I haven't used it, and it's been one of those things where it's like, okay, do I want to spend the time using something? It's really just been a matter of hierarchy of importance. I'm pouring my time into Kotlin, RxJava, and all this stuff. I really don't need a library to build ModelView presenter architectures for me, so I haven't used it yet, but I'll try it eventually. So that's what I think of Mosby. All right, so we've got a couple questions from L4Z. So, number one, and I won't write these down just because they're quick questions. So, can you write where to start with your videos? Because L4Z wants to go through them all. So for my Q&A episodes, what I try to do now is I try to give timestamps as I'm explaining the thing. So you've brought L4Z brought up a couple things. A, that even though I'm at episode 35, the playlist only goes up to 15 for Android Live Q&A episodes, and not all of them have timestamps. And my explanation to you, L4Z, is that I am very busy, and to be perfectly honest, I am very much just a nerd that likes to talk about this stuff, and all the extra hours and hours and hours of figuring out timestamps, writing translations, doing search engine optimization, answering questions, creating content, writing code, learning code, all of the things I do, unfortunately, there's things like adding videos to playlists and doing timestamps that I'm not very good at doing. I'm one person, I work a full-time job. So my answer to you, L4Z, is essentially, I don't know exactly where to start. If you have a specific thing you want to learn, ask me and I'll tell you. But my live stream Q&A, really what I'm just giving you is all I can manage right now. And I wish I could do perfect timestamps. I wish I could do all that upkeep stuff all the time, but I can't. So anyways, but if, like I say, if you have a particular topic, I generally remember which video I've addressed it in, and you can sort of, we can figure it out that way. Anyways, I gotta fix my posture. Ugh. I've got like the hunchback thing going on. So hopefully, yeah. L4Z asked specifically, why is Q&A number 35 when I see 15 videos in Android Live Q&A episodes? It's because I've been too lazy to add all the videos to the playlist because I haven't had time to think about it. So, anyways. What else have we got here? That's an interesting question. Oh, two interesting questions. What's up, eh? Okay, so a couple interesting questions. Let's get into this here. I'm sorry, I'm not even... I'm just going to call you SW. I'm not going to type out long random names. SW asks, can we write... can we use activities as presenters? Where are we at? Oh, wow, that's... why did I move OBS Studio over there? That didn't make any sense whatsoever. Okay, so, oops. So SWS, can we use activities as presenters? So that's a good question. So here's the thing, SW. Yes, you can. I don't, in my opinion, this is going to be a little bit of an opinion piece, but I do think most people who are more senior developers would probably agree with me, but just a little bit of an opinion alert, because for me to say you should never use an activity as a presenter, maybe there's someone out there that's figured out some way to do that properly. Let me explain why I don't think you should. Number one, fundamentally, I actually talk about this extensively in my article that I'm writing when I discuss. I have an article coming out on ModelView presenters, so everyone should check that out. I'd love to hear feedback on it. But one of the key, so one of the fundamentals of a presenter is that it shouldn't, how can I say this? It should mostly be concerned with logic and event handling. And so it follows that you shouldn't have, so this is, let me sort of back up a bit. A common thing you'll hear is that presenters shouldn't reference framework code. So when I have a presenter, so if I open up a presenter right here and I click this little import button, what you're going to see here is that it doesn't actually reference any Android classes. It doesn't reference activity, nothing from the framework. It does reference RxJava, which is a little bit of an exception to this rule. But RxJava is a communication tool, so I don't mind having my presenter use that. It can reference other objects, but not Android framework stuff. Why? Oh, I just accidentally opened Spotify. Great. So this is, oops. So this is kind of a principle, SW, I want you to take note of. Presenters shouldn't really reference framework code. And my explanation of why is more or less that a presenter is fundamentally an object, in my opinion, which should be concerned about logic and event handling. It shouldn't be concerned ever about view binding, and it shouldn't be concerned about storing state, storing data. So if you're storing data in your presenter, or you're talking to your UI like directly, I think you're doing something wrong. You don't have a presenter anymore, essentially. So why would we not want to use activities as presenters? Well, what is an activity? And what I mean here is, what are the use cases? What is an activity designed for? Number one, I would say first and foremost, is that by nature of being the point where you deploy everything in a given feature of your, sorry, I know that's out of view, application. By nature of being the point where you deploy everything in a given feature of your application, so like the starting point for a main feature is generally going to be an activity, it's immediately a kind of container, a fragile container, essentially. So, and this is a technical term. A container is a thing which things exist in at runtime, sort of. Application class is also a container. So activity, I think of it like a subcontainer. Now, activities are also designed to manage user interfaces. So they're kind of also a view when we're thinking model view presenter architecture. So you can use them like a view. And I would argue that these are really the only two use cases that you would want to use an activity for. I don't personally like to use them as views because they're fragile, and to me, it's just not really, it doesn't make sense with my architecture, and especially because they're fragile. And what I mean by fragile is that they get destroyed very often, like with orientation changes and stuff. So, so this is kind of my point here, is that why wouldn't you want to use it as a presenter? For starters, presenters shouldn't really talk to framework code as a general rule. And activity is always going to reference framework code by design. Secondly, fundamentally, when I look in activity, I really only see two reasonable ways it should be used. Number one, it is basically by design a container, and that's how I use it. I don't actually use them as views. I just use them as a container to deploy my model view presenter stuff into. You can absolutely use them as views, and since they're directly tied to the view hierarchy, that's totally fine. I personally use fragments, so yeah. Anyways, I'll need to go. I didn't note what time that was, which was stupid. Ah, damn it. Whatever. I'll have, whatever. Anyways, so that's kind of my answer. So, can you use activities as presenters? I don't know about you, but I live in a free country. Yeah, you can if you really want to. Should you use activities as a presenter? I have not. What I will say, I'm not going to say never. What I will say is I have not yet seen an example where it makes sense to use activities as a presenter. So hopefully that answers your question. I have another question, and I will note the time, about fragments. One. Whatever, let's just say 900. And this one is from Chase. Should we avoid using fragments whenever possible? This is an interesting question. So, this is a funny one. So, should we avoid using fragments whenever possible? So, I'm going to go out on a limb here, Chase, and I'm going to assume that you've read other people kind of shitting on fragments, or you've read maybe some Stack Overflow stuff of people being like, no, you shouldn't use them. Don't use them for this, use them for that. And that kind of thing. And what I would suggest to you is the idea that you should just never use a fragment is fundamentally absurd. And there are people out there that have that opinion. What I do think you should do is like when should you use a fragment? I'll basically answer this in a similar way as above. When should you use a fragment? Or like, when should you use a fragment? Fragments work great as views. Cut and dry. You don't need to use fragments as views. They work really well as views. Why do they work well as views? Because they're not activities and they have direct access to their own view hierarchy. And they can maintain their instance on orientation changes. So that's why I like to use them as views. And if you open basically any project of mine in the last 2 years with little exception, you will see that my view classes are fragments. Because they work well for that. Especially when you use Kotlin synthetic properties so that you can like directly talk to your UI without even having to call findView by ID. Hint, hint. Anyways, fragments work great as views. Fragments can be used as sort of lightweight threads. I don't really do this. So the reason why you might want to use a fragment as a lightweight thread is also because it can persist through orientation changes / activity destruction. So if you have like a background operation, you can stick it in a fragment and almost treat it like a life cycle independent kind of thread type thing. I don't do this because I use other things for that. I use RxJava to handle that kind of stuff. But you can also use them in this way. Like I've seen actually Kaushik Gopal from Fragmented podcast. I've seen him use fragments like that. And so you can kind of do that. Now, this attitude that I do come across, like never use fragments. Listen, like there are people out there, I'm not saying you have this opinion, Chase. Hopefully you don't. I think you're just asking a question. But there are people out there who are so bold as to say that you should never use a fragment, even though it's basically the friggin' developers of the platform saying, here is a view class for you. So never use that? I don't think so. There are alternatives. You can use compound views. There's like a library. What was it called? There was a library Jake Wharton created that had fragmentless views. I don't think I can remember it off the top of my head. Whatever. There's compound views, third-party view libs. You can use other things, but these are the cases where if someone tells me I shouldn't, well, not so much the second one, I don't really do that, but particularly as views, if someone tells me that I should not do that, then they really need to give me a pretty damn good argument why, because I don't really see any issue with using a platform solution. Anyways, let me run a quick commercial break, have some coffee, and then I think we'll do maybe one more question. All right. All right. Oh. So SWS Where can I ask questions to Ryan? We're going to ask questions to Ryan, who is me, I think. I hope. Last I checked. So my suggestion is join the Slack channel. Yeah, join the Slack channel, link in the description box. And the Slack channel is even better because instead of just getting my opinion, you get the opinion of several talented developers. Like, we got a good group of people going on in the Slack channel. So what I would suggest to you is, if there's like a heading, Slack is like a team chat thing. Actually, I'm going to look into other options for, like, I'm going to look into maybe Discord and other things, because I would actually like to have a service where we could even chat through voice chat and stuff like that. And almost, you know, I like Slack, but I'm going to look at other options. Anyways, yeah, join the Slack channel, SW. My only stipulation is the rules for joining the Slack channel are you need to always be respectful to everyone in that channel. And so when you're asking a question or when you're arguing with someone, that's fine. It's just always be disrespectful and don't go in there with like an attitude of trying to be the smartest person in the room, because A, you're probably not, especially if Daryl is in the room. But B, don't be an asshole. Just, you know, the Wise Ass Slack channel, it's a community where people don't get treated like crap when they have a question. So I keep it that way. So be respectful and we'll get along fine. What else have we got? Oh yeah, Chitan mentions post the article on Medium. I am finally going to do that. And yeah, I think that was your idea originally, Chitan. So thanks, bro. I will be doing that. I'm going to do a post on my website and on Medium, and then I'm also going to do an accompanying video tutorial. And so I'm really excited for that, because I think it's I think my goal with it is to really take all of the magic out of things like ModelView Presenter and really just get to the first principles. Anyways, what else can we talk about? Abhishek, I don't really have a good enough opinion on Google Progressive Web Apps to really give you an opinion on that yet. I see they have a lot of new tools coming out, but yep. All right, so what I'm going to do is I've got one more sort of quick question here for a resource, and then I'll just kind of hang out for a couple minutes and just do off-topic banter with people if people have like general questions about whatever. But so the last question I have here, sort of technically oriented question, is where can I find a resource for building a clean architecture step by step? And I forgot to write down your name. Where is it? Joe. We're going to find a resource for building a clean architecture step by step. More or less was the question. So, so I can, let me, this is kind of a difficult question because the more, I've been studying ModelView Presenter and clean architecture for over a year now, and it can be very hard to actually nail down what a clean architecture is in terms of like a specific thing, so much as when I think of a clean architecture, I think of an architecture which applies certain principles, but it doesn't necessarily need to be, say, ModelView Presenter or ModelView Controller or something really specific. It's almost more how the architecture is built than what it actually is that, in my mind, makes it a clean architecture. And that understanding is actually going to require more than just one specific tutorial. So what I would suggest to you, Joe, is where I think you should start, and this is more or less where I started, is first, start with a 3-layer architecture. Maybe you're already there, but just for everyone watching, start with a 3-layer architecture. So you can choose MVP, you can choose MVC, you can choose whatever you want, just something 3 layers. Why do I say that? In order to have a clean architecture, the first thing you need to do, more or less, I'm not saying the first thing actually, but one of the many things you need to do is you need to separate the concerns of the application. My Model View Presenter article, which I'll hopefully have done by the end of tomorrow, will talk about a lot of the issues in the context of clean architecture. For my resources, I would actually highly recommend my Recycler View tutorial, 2017. Why do I recommend that? It's not actually really in the video. I don't even use the word Model View Presenter. I don't even describe it like Model View Controller, Model View Presenter, or whatever. What I do is I isolate a small little app into 3 layers, essentially. And so this is an entry point, and then from there I would suggest looking into Model View Presenter, or you can... I have a tutorial on Model View ViewModel, but again, that's a touchy subject for me. Maybe Model View Intent. So for my resources, start here. Or you could do my room database tutorial, which is Model View ViewModel. I will also shortly, I will have a full MVP tutorial. So once you have some kind of an architecture, then we can get into the specifics of how to actually build it. So then look into solid principles. What else? Separation of concerns. I'm just going to throw a bunch of terms at you. I will explain some of these terms in my Model View Presenter article. So what I'm saying is really read that article when it's done. Separation of concerns. And then you're going to have other things like cohesion, coupling. So first, I would suggest start with 3-layer architecture, then look into solid principles. And I wish I could summarize this really quickly, but it would take me like 15 minutes if I tried to do it really quickly. Same with this, and these things are easier, but I'm kind of just giving you leads here, hopefully, Joe. And, but, you know, at the start of an episode, you can kind of ask me about a specific part of clean architecture. A great person to look for content, what am I trying to say here? Just check out Uncle Bob's work on clean architecture. Uncle Bob explains it. Uncle Bob is actually, he's not my uncle, but Robert. Uncle Bob's work on clean architecture. I have his book on, where is it? Had his book on clean architecture, whatever. So that's a really good resource. And the last thing is that I would say to you, Joe, stick around this channel because I am going to try to continue to refine my explanations of architecture and my quality of architecture. And I'm very lucky to have people like Durrell, my friend, who also appears to be very concerned about building a really good clean architecture. So there's going to be lots more content on this channel on the subject of clean architecture. It's just, you know, life is life, and I'm in a position where I don't have time to make all the videos that I would like to make. So, but stay tuned, lots more good content on the subject of clean architecture. It's probably something that I will always talk about because it's just, to me, in a nutshell, what is clean architecture? It's called being a good software architect, being good at your frigging job. Like, some people argue, I hear arguments to the effect of, clean architecture is complicated and therefore I don't want to invest time learning it because I could spend that time building applications. And some people will make that argument, and to me what that argument sounds like is, I suck at my job, but I want to keep getting paid to write crappy things, and I don't really want to learn how to do it better, but it doesn't matter because time is money, is essentially how I would boil down that argument. So anyways, but I admit that's a fairly incendiary statement. Anyways, yeah, those are my kind of main suggestions. It's tough though, because you're asking like a step-by-step thing, and clean architecture is a big topic. Big topic. All right, just going to ramble for a couple minutes, say hi to everyone, and then we're going to call it a day. Thanks, Chetan. Chetan says, Mon, Ryan, and Dachau, Bitsy, you guys rock. Hey, you rock, Chetan. Chetan has been one of my, I believe Chetan is one of my oldest supporters. So I really appreciate you stopping by and saying hi every now and again. Much appreciated, man. That's the thing. Yes, that's such a. Yeah, so Tina just made a really important point. So let me just share. See, this is an interesting. This is something I want to talk about. Tina says. So Tina makes the point in the chat, clean architecture, if people don't get it, they don't know they suck. That is such an important statement. So a while ago, I was reading about this thing called neuro-linguistic programming and et cetera, et cetera. Ryan's a giant nerd. He reads things like that. And one of the things they talked about is that there's 4 stages of knowing. And I might butcher these. So there's unconscious incompetence, conscious incompetence, oh, how does it go? I might mix up the last 2. Conscious competence and then unconscious competence. I might be screwing this up, but let me translate these. So I don't know the topic or how bad I am at it. Maybe. And then I don't know the topic, but I know that I don't know it. That's maybe not super helpful. I know the topic somewhat, but you're getting there essentially. I know the topic somewhat, but it requires thinking. And then there's unconscious. I might be screwing this last one up here, but I think unconscious competence. I know the topic to the degree that it's basically what I would call implicit, maybe implicit memory? I don't know. But the fundamental thing we're talking about here, which so Tina mentioned this, so if people don't understand that, they don't know they're bad at it. So when someone comes to me in the stage of unconscious incompetence, that's kind of my favorite thing. And a lot of people, there's this weird thing in human nature where if I feel like I know something, I don't really do this, but if I know something, some people will do this. So some people, when they have information, when they understand a concept, that's like a power trip. And when someone else doesn't knows that and asks a question, the response will be like, oh, you don't understand this? That's sad. Like this weird feeling of superiority because I know something, really. And that is so just disgusting and sinister and pathetic, because how can you expect someone to know about a topic and understand it if they've never even heard it and they don't even know what it's about? So what I always try and do is when I'm teaching people, I try to recognize where they're coming from. Like, if I'm going to talk about RxJava, the way I'm going to explain it to someone who's never programmed before, or someone who's done some programming, or someone who's quite good at programming, like, that's all going to change. And I never want to make someone feel bad because they don't know the topic. But what I find with clean architecture and things like RxJava is people, I've also heard there's the Dunning-Kruger effect is another thing, but people who know like a little bit about the topic. This is actually, I know the basic idea, but I don't know how much I don't know. And this is the tricky part. And what I hear a lot, and this is, so a lot of people, they'll maybe understand like the basics of, or they'll look at clean architecture, and then what they'll do is they'll say, holy crap, this looks like really complicated. And I think I have an idea what it's about, which is just doing architecture a different way, but I don't necessarily really need to do this. So essentially we have people making conclusions about clean architecture, as an example, without really understanding what it is. And what it is, in my opinion, clean architecture as an umbrella is just building apps properly. And so that's a very it's a very valid point that Tina made, which is that if people aren't even able to get to the basics of it, we run into this situation. It seems to be human nature to hate things we don't understand, or hate things that are really complicated. I never had that. I always wanted to understand complicated things, but anyways, I'm rambling. Interesting little discussion point. No, that's totally true. Yeah, and I have to apologize. Maybe it sounded like earlier I was angry with people who don't understand clean architecture. And Tina mentions that. I apologize if that's how I came off, and I totally understand if what I was kind of reflecting was the anger I have with people who argue with me about clean architecture that don't really understand what they're arguing. Not people that don't understand it at all, and I do apologize if it kind of came off as me just like insulting people who don't understand clean architecture. I'm kind of doing that, but it's the way that people... I've had experiences in the past where I'll try and like teach clean architecture, and people will like really argue with me against the pragmatics of actually, again, let me just go really quickly to again, I'll publish the whole article, but in one of the sections, which I'm actually debating whether I should even include it for this reason, where do I have the... Yeah, in one of the sections of this article, I discuss the most common counter-argument against separation of concerns, solid principles, clean architecture, and all that. And the most common argument I hear is pragmatics, a pragmatic argument. The most common, and so what I said earlier was a rebuttal to that pragmatic argument of I shouldn't, the pragmatic argument of this is complicated and is a big time investment, therefore I don't want to learn it, is essentially what I was arguing against. Anyways, can't wait to publish that article and get feedback on it. Oh, no, I don't. Tina says, I don't mean to put you off. I'm not off put at all. What you said is totally valid. No, I'm always happy to do it. With people who I know aren't jerks, I'm always happy if you like want to question what I say, or please do. Again, people sometimes get the impression that I'm very good at social interactions and stuff, whereas it's actually quite a struggle for me sometimes. I don't always have a good ability to understand how I am coming off to certain people. So it's, you know, it's helpful when people point that kind of stuff out. Oh yeah, absolutely. Can you tell me when you're doing a Q&A? Yeah, so I always do a Q&A Sunday at 8 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, as questioned by L4Z. So this is basically my time where if you want to ask me a question, you can do it, essentially. And that's why I do it every Sunday. Also, Sunday is my day off. Day off, so to speak. But you can also, you know, you can chat. Here's the thing, like, I would love to be able to do several streams a week, and I want to do that eventually, where maybe like a beginner Q&A session and an advanced Q&A session, and maybe even just an off-topic one. But currently all I can do is just one Sunday. That's all I can guarantee people, is for about 1 to 2 hours every Sunday. If you want to ask me a question, this is where you can do it. I don't know why people would want that, because I'm just like a friggin', you know, small town farm boy dropout, but I seem to be doing okay. All right, so I think that's going to be it for today's discussion. So thank you for watching, everyone. It's been an absolute pleasure. Watch out for that ModelView Presenter article, because it's a lot more than just ModelView Presenter. To me, I'm trying to structure the article such that it's more or less an introduction into so many different things. It's to get you started thinking about your code in the context of a clean architecture, sort of stealthily. So I'm really excited for it. So thank you so much for watching. Yeah, have a good one. Happy Sunday. Peace out.